Okay, I hope my voice is clear now. Is my voice clear? Okay. Again, now in this slide, we are talking about the main part of the flower. The main part of the flower is made of anther, which is this part, okay, the yellow part, and this, which is the filament. Okay, again, as you can see here in this slide, this is share it again. Sharing. Okay, the anther is making pollen grains, and then pollen grains are going to the stigma. This is actually called pollination. So pollination is the movement of pollen grains or of pollen from the stamen or from the anther of a flower to the stigma of to the stigma of the same kind of flower. Okay, here is the stamen produced by the anther, and then when it is moving or when it moves to the stigma of the same flower or the same kind of flower in another plant, this is actually pollination. So only movement is pollination. Okay, we have two types of pollination. The first type is self-pollination. Okay, self-pollination, as you can see here, okay, pollen grains are going from the anther to the stigma or in the same flower. This is self-pollination. So when pollen grains go to the stigma in the same flower, this is called pollination, self-pollination. But when pollen grains are going from a flower to another flower stigma of the same kind of plant, this is called the cross-pollination. So we have two types of pollination. Number one, self-pollination and cross-pollination. At first, the self-pollination is the movement of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or in the same plant. Number two, cross-pollination. This is the movement of pollen grains from a flower to another flower with the same kind. Okay, let's make it more clear here, the two types of pollination. Here we have when the pollen grains go, okay, from the flower to the stigma of the same flower, this is called what? This is called self. This is called self-pollination. Great. Okay. And when pollen grains go from the flower to another flower in the same plant, also this is self-pollination. But when the flower or when pollen grains go or move, okay, from a plant to the stigma of other plant, so this is called the cross pollination. So we have two types of pollination, self-pollination and cross-pollination. I hope it is clear. So again, what we have take now, we talked about uh, pollination, which is the movement of which is the movement of pollen grains from the anther or the stamen or the male part to the stigma of the female part with the same kind of flower. We have two types of pollination, which is self-pollination, okay, and cross-pollination. Cross-pollination, this is the movement of pollen grains from a flower to the stigma the of another plant with the same type of flower. It should be the same type of flower or the same kind of the plant. Okay, I mean, uh, now this is also another description or another explanation for self and the cross pollination. Self pollination, which is here the movement of pollen grains to from stamen or from the anther in a flower to the stigma of the same flower, and here the cross pollination, which is the movement of pollen grains, okay, from a flower to another plant stigma, the same kind of flower. Look at these two flowers; they are with the same type of plant. I hope you understood this part. Now, let's talk about types or ways of pollination. Okay, ways of pollination. So, what do you think? How can pollen grains move? Of course, there are lots of things that make pollen grains move to make the cross pollination or to make the self pollination. We have lots of things in nature. Okay, first, as you can see here in this chart, make it more clear. We have birds, we have butterflies, we have bees, we have bats. Okay, so these are the the ways of pollination. These are pollinators. Pollinators, okay, you will understand it more from this slide. Okay, at first, look at this slide and then we will explain it. Okay, as you can see here, there is a bee. The bee came to the flower and My voice is good now. I think my voice is good. Okay, it is recording. And let's move on to this slide, which is we are in birds pollinators. Okay, so birds are here, or birds go to the attractive colors of the flower and to take food of the flower, to take nectar. Also, pollen grains that can be stuck in their feathers, and they can they go to another flower. So pollen grains that can be sticked onto the stigma of the stem or another flower in another plant to make pollination. Also, birds and bats. Can you see bats? Okay, it is here to take its food, and there are pollen grains here that can stick in its body and it can move pollen grains. So we have pollinators that can move pollen grains, like what? Like bees, like butterflies, like birds, moths, like bats. So my question now is, why do you think bats or these flies, these insects, come to the flower? I described it to take its food, which is nectar and the protein. Also, flowers, they are very attractive. They have very bright colors. Okay, as you can see, also, they have a scent or smell. They produce nectar. So they produce nectar. They have a scent or a smell, and they have very bright colored petals. Also, they flowers that can have stripes. Can you see these stripes? Can you see these marks on the flower? Okay, these marks also can guide the bird or the insect to the nectar inside the flower. As you can see here, it's very clearly, okay? So these stripes can guide the bee to get the nectar from the inside of the flower, okay? So this is the adaptation, flowers, the adaptation to attract the pollinators. Pollinators can be bees, can be flower, can be bats, can be moths, can be birds, okay, can be butterflies. And flowers, the adaptation, you have to save it very good, as it is very, very important part of our lesson. So flowers have very bright colors, okay. Number two, they have a scent or a smell. Number three, they produce nectar, and they have stripes, marks on the petals to guide the insects to the nectar inside the flower. Number four, we have also, this is from nature, wind pollination. Wind pollination, the pollen below in the pollen blows in the wind from anthers to the stigmas of other flowers, as you can see. But when the pollination happens in some special kinds of plants, like grass, like rice, and like corn, this is rice, this is grass, and this is corn. Okay, so pollen grains are moving from a plant to another by wind pollination. Okay, the pollination blows pollen grains from a plant to another plant. Okay, right. Here the adaptation of flowers, okay, by wind. Can you see here the petals? Can you see the difference between the petals by insect and moth pollination by pollinators and wind pollinators? The flowers, they are very different. There we said, I mean, here in this flowers, it is very different from when the flowers, the adaptation. Here you can find very bright flowers. They have Mars, they have nectar, they have a smell. Okay, but here you can see here the flowers, they are small, they are not bright, they don't have a scent or nectar. And as you can see here, the pollen grains are very small, very smooth, okay, very light, so that it can be carried easily by the wind. Okay, let's move on to the last part of our lesson. I know that it has lots of parts, um, but to make a quick revision on what we talked today about, we talked at first about number one, what is the female and the male parts of the flower. We talked about anther that makes pollen, the stigma that is sticky to catch pollen, and this is called the pollination. Okay, the movement when the pollen grains move from the anther to the stigma, this is called pollination. Okay, we have two types of pollination, cross and the self-pollination. Number one, self-pollination. This is the movement of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or another flower in the same plant. But from a flower to another one, okay, it goes from the first plant to the other one to the other one. This is called cross-pollination. Number three, we talked today about pollinators, the ways of pollination. It can happen by insects or birds, like bees, like butterflies, like bats, like moths. Okay, and we talked as well about the adaptation of flowers. The flowers, they are very colorful, they have marks, they have scent, and we talked about when the pollination that only happens or that happens in special kinds of plants like grass, like rice, like corn. And the flowers here, they are small, not bright, and pollen grains are very small, very are small, smooth, light. Okay, so that can be easily carried by the wind to another place. Now let's talk about, okay, fertilization. Fertilization, when pollen grains, okay, are joined together to make eggs. This is called fertilization. So this is when I talk about pollination, just the movement of pollen grains to the stigma. But joining, this is fertilization. Joining it to make the egg. Okay. After joining, it makes seeds. So the reproduction or the reproduced part, okay, in the plants, which is seeds. Okay. So pollen again, when pollen grains go to the stigma, this is pollination. But when they join together to make the egg in the ovary of the plant, this is fertilization. After that, seeds are made, which is the produced or the reproduced part of the flower or the part of reproduction in the plant, which is the seed. Seeds grow up, it makes the plant and then the flower. Fertilization happens in the ovary of the plant. This is the ovary of the plant to make the egg. And finally, okay, fertilization only happens uh, if the pollen grains and the eggs are from the same kind of the same plant, of the same kind or the same type of the plant or of the flower. Here, can you see here? We are talking. So the movement is just pollination, movement of pollen. But joining pollen with uh, with the eggs in the ovary. This is called pollination. This is called the fertilization. After fertilization, what happens? Do you think it with a flower? This is the last slide, by the way, before we have our questions. Okay, after joining or after fertilization, flowers die. Stamens, which are the male part of the flower, die. The ovary, the ovary, okay, makes the fruit. And inside the fruit, there are seeds. So the protects seeds. Okay, so this is what happens after fertilization. Moving on, let's make a summary. We talked today about pollination and the fertilization. Okay, that produce the parts or the reproduce the part of the plant is the seed. Okay, um, fertilization, pollination happens to the same kind of flower or of plant. Let's move on the next part, which is the questions. Okay, let's make quick to questions slide. Okay, here it is. Number one, flowers have different parts. Like here we have petal, anther, we have nectary, sepal, we have stigma, over, which is the carpel. Number A, letter A, why do flowers have petals? Why do you think flowers have petals? To attract insects. Okay, they have bright colors to attract insects. Okay, B, circle the part of the plant or of the flower which produce pollen. Where are pollen grains produced? Anther, carpel, or ovary? Think about it. Of course, it is in the anther. C, circle a female part of the flower. Nectary, petal, sepal, or stigma. The female part is stigma, ovary. Okay, of course, it is the stigma because we don't have ovary here in these places. Question number two. Here we have part of the flower. We have A and we have B. So A, what is the name of part A? Part A, of course, is the stigma that catches pollen. What does part B contain? Part B, which is the ovary, it contains eggs. Seeds are formed when pollen and eggs join, join together, not move. So this process is called fertilization. Okay, let's move on to this question. All flowering plants produce seeds. Why do plants need to produce seeds? Why do plants still produce seeds? Fertilization, is this germination, is this growth, is this reproduction? I told you that seeds are for reproduction. Okay, and this is our session today for pollination of the plants. I hope you understood it very clearly today. Thank you. Bye.